Italie.
J'ouvre maintenant la séance.
I call this meeting to order. I'm sorry about the technical problems that some of us have had. So, Mr. Beaulieu, you can hear us properly now? We can't hear him. Mr. Beaulieu, can you hear us? Yes, can you hear us now? Yes, everything's fine now. So, I call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 45 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Official Languages. Pursuant to the order of reference of Monday, May 30, 2022, the committee resumes its examination of Bill C-13, an act to amend the Official Languages Act, edicting the use of French within private corporations under federal jurisdiction. Pursuant to our routine motion, I inform the committee that all members have done sound tests before the meeting as required. Today, we're undertaking clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-13. I therefore welcome the officials of the Department of Canadian Heritage who are here at the committee to answer technical questions, and from Citizenship and Immigration as well, and from Treasury Board Secretariat. Mr. Chairman, could you identify these people, please? Yes, but Mr. Vice Chair, you are way ahead of me. I was going to do that. So before I go any further, I could start with Ms. Boyer and ask her to introduce her team and the reason for her presence today at this committee before we proceed with clause by clause. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to express my condolences to members of this committee for the death of the former Minister Jim Carr. I had an opportunity to work very closely with him when he was Minister of Natural Resources, and I had a great deal of respect for him. He's a gentleman who required a lot from the public service, but also gave a lot to the public service as well. So my sympathies to you parliamentarians who worked closely with him. That's a great loss. So I'm Julie Boyer. I'm the ADM responsible for official languages, heritage, and regions within Canadian Heritage Canada. The Director General of Official Languages responsible for strategic planning and the modernization plan of the bill on official languages, of course. The development of the action plan, which is a 5-year plan for official languages in Canada. We also manage transfer payment agreements for provinces and territories for offering French in both official languages and for education as well in both official languages. I have with me 2 colleagues from the Director General. I will give them the floor, and then I will go toward my colleagues from Immigration and Citizenship and from Treasury Board. Sarah. Yes, thank you, Julie. Good morning. I'm Sarah Boilly, Director General, Official Languages, and I'm pleased to be with you today. Hello. My name is Chantal Thérien. I'm a manager at the Directorate of Modernization of Official Languages Act at Canadian Heritage. Hello. I'm Alain Desruisseaux, Director General for Francophone Immigration at the Department of Immigration, Citizenship and Refugees. I have the responsibility for everything regarding major policies for Francophone affairs and work in partnership with all our internal partners, since this is a horizontal commitment by various departments. We also have a responsibility about programs for settlement of Francophone immigrants, integration of Francophones who are under our responsibility as well. The commitment to these communities is at the very center of our activities and guides everything we do, whether it's developing policies or programs. Thank you. Hello, my name is Mr. Wells, I'm the executive director of the Center of Excellence. I represent the Treasury Board Secretariat. The role of the TBS when it comes to official languages is to see to communications in both languages, the language of work, fair participation of francophones and anglophones within the public service. The role of our center is to support the 200 federal institutions in their responsibilities to enact the Official Languages Act. And I'm here to support my colleagues from Heritage Canada, who are the lead on this bill. Thank you.
Alors, merci.
So thank you, dear technical advisors and experts represented here today. Perhaps while we do this clause-by-clause consideration, we will have to turn to you once in a while. Before I go any further, before I begin the process of clause-by-clause, I'd like to give a few explanations to members of the committee on the way we proceed with clause-by-clause of a bill. Yes, go ahead. Before we start that explanation, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to have the floor to get back to last Thursday's meeting, please. Go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to apologize for the tone that I used last Thursday, and I think that the substance of it was correct, but not the tone. That was not acceptable. So I want to apologize to the interpreters who may have had a situation or a more difficult period. So I did want to apologize to the interpreters and my colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Bien apprécié. Donc, j'ai besoin de vous donner quelques explications sur le déroulement.
I'd like to give you a few explanations about what we're going to do today. As its name indicates, this exercise is to consider in order all the clauses of a bill. I will put each clause under deliberation one by one, and every one can be the subject of debate before it's put to a vote. If an amendment is proposed at the clause in question, I will give the floor to the member proposing it, who can explain it if he or she wishes. The amendment can then be debated and voted upon when no other member wants to take the floor. The amendments are examined in the order in which they appear in the kit, the package you receive from the clerk. It's important to note that all the amendments and sub-amendments must be submitted in writing to the clerk of the committee.
Amendments must be legally correct. They must be drawn up correctly, but must also be procedurally correct. The chair may rule an amendment out of order if it contravenes the principle of the bill or exceeds the scope of the bill. The principle and scope having been adopted together with the bill by the House at second reading. Or if the amendment impinges on the Crown's financial initiative. If you want to remove a clause from the bill altogether, you should vote against the clause when it comes up for a vote, rather than move an amendment to remove it. Let me repeat this one because it is important. If one of you, anyone here, wishes to completely remove a clause from a bill, remove it altogether, you need only vote against it when it comes to a vote, rather than moving an amendment specifically to remove it. As this is a first experience for many members, the chair will proceed slowly. And that is always a challenge for me, as you know, but I will proceed slowly so that everyone can follow the proceedings. Each amendment has a number, as you have likely seen in the top right-hand corner, which indicates which party has submitted it. For an amendment to be moved, no seconder is required. Once an amendment has been proposed on the floor, it requires the unanimous consent of all committee members to withdraw it from consideration. During our debate on any amendment, members may put forward sub-amendments. These need not be approved by the member who proposed the original amendment. we can only consider one sub-amendment at a time, and that sub-amendment cannot be changed. You may remember that having caused us a bit of confusion. Anyway, I won't go into that, but it has been a little problematic in the past, so we have that strict rule then. We may only consider one sub-amendment at a time, and that sub-amendment cannot be changed while it's being considered. When an amendment is sub-amendment, as we know, we first vote on the sub-amendment. Another sub-amendment may then be submitted, or the committee may return to the principal amendment and vote on it. Once all clauses have been voted on, then we vote on the title of the bill per se, and we must also vote to reprint the bill such that the House have an up-to-date version at the report stage. And finally, the committee must ask the chair to report the bill to the House of Commons. And that report includes solely the text of what we have voted, and if necessary, any clauses that have been removed. So I welcome us all to this undertaking and wish us all a very good clause-by-clause meeting of C13. But before we begin, I would like to go back to what Ms. Boyer said. Very wise. Thank you for having spoken to the fact that we have lost a dear colleague, and I would like to take advantage of our airtime here at the committee to offer, in the names of all members, to the family and loved ones of Minister Jim Carr, Prior Minister Jim Carr, our sincere condolences. This said, let us begin our clause-by-clause consideration. So, pursuant to Standing Order 75, consideration of Clause 1, the short title, and of the preamble are postponed. The chair calls Clause 2. In our case, we have CPC 1 in the upper right-hand corner. So is this amendment being submitted for consideration? Mr. Godin. Thank you, Chair. We hope to be in line with procedure. You can be assured that I have full respect for our institutions. If I make any mistakes, I'm sure that my colleagues and you will surely know how to get me back in order. So my first amendment, Chair, I think it's very important to propose this, given that Quebec has a special status, and we would like to ensure. Shall I read what I have here? Shall I read it? All right. Then, given that it is very short, I will allow myself to read it. The Bill C13 in Clause 2 be amended by replacing line 18 on page 1 to line 16 on page 2 with the following. To respect Quebec's language planning choices as set out in the Charter of the French language. We must keep in mind that Quebec is a small group of Francophones invaded by the gigantic population of Anglophones in North America. So I think it's important that this be specified right here as I read in the bill. That's my comment so far. Are there any questions about the amendment? Yes, Mr. Garneau, the floor is yours. You have the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here to share my opinion about the amendment, or thank you for inviting me to share my opinion about the amendment that Mr. Godin has just put forward. And I will start by saying that C13 is, of course, a federal enactment about the official languages of Canada. In my opinion, it is inappropriate to refer to the Quebec Charter of the French language in a federal enactment, C13, on the official languages of Canada. By doing so, we would embed, indeed, the Charter of the French language in a federal enactment. Let's keep in mind that Quebec's Charter of the French language is no longer solely Act 101 that we've all become used to, but a charter that has been changed with Act 93, which of course protects the French language. That's a good thing in Quebec, but also discriminates against Quebec's Anglophone minority. Beyond that, Act 93 of Quebec also invokes the notwithstanding clause on a preventive basis, which is problematic on a number of levels. It means we will not consider any argument or any claim that in any way counters or questions the Charter as reformed by Quebec Law 93. We feel that it would be a serious error on our part as federal MPs on a federal committee examining a federal enactment to leave free rein to Quebec to do whatever it wishes in matters of language within Quebec. We, as federal MPs, have a duty to all linguistic communities of Canada, all official language minority communities of Canada, including those who speak English in Quebec. Thank you, Mr. Garneau. I have first Ms. Letenzio, then Mr. Gaudin, Mr. Beaulieu. Madame Letenzio, over to you.
I'd like to make the following comments. Being an Anglophone, as you know, from Quebec, there's a certain reality in Quebec for the linguistic minority community there. And I can tell you first and foremost that the law seeks to promote and protect French in Quebec and across Canada. And I think that we are all unanimous on that. There's no hesitation. There's no reconsideration. We're all speaking the same language. But I do also want to echo some of the comments that have been made, and I will express them in English. Bill 96, of course, has been enacted last summer in 2022 and has become the new Charter of the French language and replaces the old Bill 101. The issue with Bill 96 and the Anglophone linguistic community in Quebec is very anxious and fearful of this law, and it has become the new charter. And why its most use of its preemptive clause, the notwithstanding clause, is a great concern for the Anglophones because this linguistic minority community in Quebec has guaranteed rights in virtue of the Quebec Charter of the French language, as well as the Canadian Constitution. And therefore, this law, Bill 96, is shielded from any contestation that any linguistic minority community, the Anglophone in Quebec, would have. So it poses a grave problem, and any reference to it in a federal law, you can understand, is of considerable, worry for this community. So what I'd like to do, Mr. Chair, is walk through, because the amendment speaks to deleting specifically lines of what we have in Bill C-13, and I would like to walk the committee through and read the lines that my colleague is suggesting that we delete, and then I would like to make some comments on that. So we have in Clause 2, subsection 2, and we start with, and whereas the Government of Canada, so we keep that, and we're proposing to delete the following, is committed to enhancing the vitality and supporting the development of English and French linguistic minority communities, taking into account their uniqueness, diversity, and historical and cultural contributions to Canadian, I'm going to page 2, society, as an integral part of the two official language communities of Canada, and to fostering full recognition and use of English and French in Canadian society. And whereas the Government of Canada is committed to protecting and promoting the French language, recognizing that French is in a minority situation in Canada and North America due to the predominant use of English. And whereas the Government of Canada is committed to cooperating with provincial and territorial governments and their institutions to support the development of English and French linguistic minority communities, to provide services in both English and French, to respect the constitutional guarantees of minority language, educational rights, and to enhance opportunities for all to learn both English and French. So, Mr. Chair, this is what we're proposing to do away with. Now, I would like to remind the committee that Canada's character is founded on the principle that we have 2 official languages and we have 2 official linguistic minority communities. There have been, during the course of the study, one colleague in particular who has almost put in doubt that there's a linguistic Anglophone community in Quebec, but I can guarantee you it exists. It is a healthy community. It is made up of 1.3 million Anglophones in Quebec. And so therefore, Mr. Chair, I think that what we're proposing here is deviating from all the linguistic regimes that we find in this beautiful country of ours. And I would say that the law is there to be able to ensure symmetry. And so I don't quite, I can tell you, first and foremost, I will be voting against this amendment for obvious reasons, but I would almost say to members around this committee that we are putting in doubt the bedrock of this country, founded on these 2 official languages, in interposing one and only one linguistic regime. These are my comments.
Thanks, Madame Latenzio. En ordre chronologique.
Chronologically speaking, Mr. Godin will follow this, followed by Mr. Beaulieu, then Mr. Serret. Mr. Godin, over to you. Thank you, Chair. I heard my 2 Liberal colleagues say that it was unnecessary and superfluous to add this matter to Bill C-13. I simply want to remind everyone that Quebec has a special status, It is surviving in an environment that's invasive, an Anglophone invading Quebec. And it's a priority to ensure that Quebec protect its language and have this entrenched in the Canadian approach. I have full respect for both official languages, but given the status of Quebec, which is a linguistic minority community, we must strengthen this to avoid French being extinguished in Quebec.
On that point, I don't comment often, but it's the exclusion. It's not the content. It's the exclusion, if I understood correctly about the lines here. Now, having said that, Mr. Beaulieu, go ahead. Thank you. Contrary to some of the other speakers, I want to point out that the Official Languages Act that has existed for 52 years is one of the main factors of the decline of French in Quebec. It's based on completely opposite principles compared to the Quebec accommodation principle, which is based on a model based on collective rights and territoriality. That is, making French the common language on the territory of Quebec. And throughout the world, systems founded on this linguistic approach of institutional bilingualism that's not territorial, such as the Official Languages Act, imposed on Quebec, everywhere we see assimilation of the minority language. This is not a linguistic accommodation that protects minority language. This is what we've been seeing for 52 years. On every census, we see assimilation that is growing for Francophones outside Quebec. And in Quebec, the imposition of this model means that there's a decline of French that is accelerating, and even Francophones in Quebec have an ever-greater tendency to adopt English to use at home. There's more and more linguistic transfer of Francophones toward English. And if we look outside Quebec, it's almost 100% of transfer to English for allophones and immigrants. They go toward English, whereas in Quebec, with great hardship through various measures, was the Canada-Quebec Agreement on Immigration and Bill 101, which was weakened quickly by the federal government, by all the mechanisms in the Official Languages Act. And we cannot continue this backing down. It's the survival of French in Canada, in North America, because Quebec is the only state that is Francophone majority in North America. It's the only state that could manage to integrate new arrivals and have social cohesion. That's why it's extremely important for the federal government. You know, when there was the Laurando-Dunton Commission at the outset, the same thing was happening as happens today. It was a historic opportunity to give collective rights to Quebecers and to respect the French language in Quebec. That was not respected by the Liberal government of the day, which did not adopt the recommendations from André Laurando, and we saw what happened next. To my mind, it's inconceivable that the entire Official Languages Act, all the subsidy mechanisms that result from it, reinforce English as an official language in Quebec. We saw this, for example, the previous speaker who says there's 1.3 million Anglophones in Quebec. That is not the reality. She is including about 33% of that number are immigrants who come from Anglophone countries, perhaps. And Quebec has to integrate those immigrants, has to have at least 90% of linguistic transfer of these allophones toward French, just to maintain its demographic weight. So we are seeing a Canadian government that wants to make Francophones a minority, does it openly, using its indicator of first official language spoken, on which Ms. Latanzio is basing herself to say 1.3 million. All the subsidized groups that get money from the federal government through the Official Languages Act, the federal government up until now has aimed to anglicize these new immigrants by various means, all kinds of means. So I think this amendment, and this is a request by the Quebec government, it seeks to have the federal government respect the self-determination of peoples, the right of self-determination of the Quebec people, that is to ensure the future of its language and make French the common language, which would be a means of social cohesion, including for the Anglophones of Quebec. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. In order, I have Mr. Serré, Ms. Latanzio, Ms. Ashton. Mr. Serré, go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the amendment, Mr. Godin. I disagree with the approach because when we look at the amendment here, there's no addition here. This is an exclusion. It removes the reference. So French is on the decline throughout the country, but this excludes people. As a Franco-Ontarian, this amendment is unacceptable. When we look at the recognition, it's important to look at various linguistic dynamics in different provinces across the country. And really, what we're looking at here adds asymmetry on official languages. I think if you look at this overall, it's an amendment that I cannot accept. When, it's important to look at the whole country and all the people in minority situations in Quebec and outside Quebec. So it's very important. So in that sense, it's not acceptable to me. Thank you, Mr. Serré. Ms. Latanzio, then Ms. Ashton.
So again, for just to make it clear to my colleague who's proposing this, it is an exclusion that he's proposing. So we want to take out the parts that I read before to be able to infer the amendment that he's proposing. My question is this, Mr. Chair, and if I could address myself to the officials, I would like to know what would be the ramifications in doing away and deleting the paragraphs that I've read out to be able to replace it with the proposed amendment. What would be the ramifications?
Thank you for your question. If I may, I'll continue in French because my notes are here in French. Premièrement, comme vous
First of all, as you explained very clearly earlier, we're talking here about removing clauses about the enhancement of minority language communities, and the importance of cooperation with the provinces and territories and the protection of French. The consequence of this amendment is the federal legislation would be subject to a provincial law. And the issue here is it opens the door to other provinces to do the same, and we'd be subject to provincial legislation with such an amendment. Thank you.
We're in right now.
Yes.
Okay, let's go. Yeah.
So is it,
Okay. That's okay.
so just to
Go ahead.
pursue in that line of thought, what would you say with regards to the ramification recognizing French in a minority situation in the rest of Canada? Does this amendment take that into account, or does it not?
Well, I believe with the provisions being removed, it does not. It refers, it introduces this idea of asymmetrical approach where French is the language in the charter, and that's what the legislation that needs to be respected is the charter in this case.
So in essence, then, it puts into question the symmetry of the English and French in Canada, and at the same time does not recognize that French is in a minority situation across the land, and
Correct.
recognizes one linguistic regime over all others across the country.
Correct. It does do that.
Thank you very much.
Madame Ashton, you're next. Monsieur Beaulieu, je vous ai vu, vous êtes un petit peu plus loin. Allez-y, Madame Ashton.
Oui, merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to share with you our position in the hopes of being able to go on to other topics. This is a historic opportunity to amend and improve the bill before us. I want to say that we at the NDP, even though we agree with the spirit of the amendment, we are against what is withdrawn from the bill in this way. What's important to mention is that we agree with recognition of the Charter of the French Language in C13, but we don't want to withdraw recognition of Francophone minorities in other provinces. So I wanted to share that. Thank you, Ms. Ashton. In order, I have Mr. Drouin, then Mr. Beaulieu, Mr. Viss. Mr. Baudouin, go ahead. To add to what my colleague Mr. Seri mentioned, I don't want to deny the right of my colleague to protect his language in his province. I respect that. But you can't do that to the detriment of the Francophone community in Ontario or Acadians or any other Francophone community in Canada. And in that spirit, I feel the same way. What we delete here from this part, we made a commitment to protecting this language, recognizing that it's in a minority situation in Canada. I can't agree with withdrawing that from the legislation. I cannot support this. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Beaulieu, then Mr. Viss. Mr. Beaulieu, go ahead. On the one hand, we don't seek to weaken the rights of Acadian and Francophone communities elsewhere. What's in the paragraphs that are deleted is the symmetry between Francophone and Acadian communities and Anglophones in Quebec, whereas they're not in the same situation at all. We saw many Francophone groups outside Quebec say that they agreed that there should be a different approach. We have to take the proposal as a whole, all the amendments, and a little further on, it is mentioned in the next amendment that we recognize the existence of Francophone and Anglophone minorities, but Anglophones in Quebec don't have the same needs as Francophone and Acadian communities in other provinces. That's a principle that was always denounced in Quebec because from the outset, Anglophones in Quebec were in the 60s or before the Official Languages Act. They were part of the elite in Canada, the Canadian English elite, and they had their own institutions, universities, hospitals, and so on that reflected a majority position rather than a minority. And the Official Languages Act contributed to maintaining that injustice. So what we want is, yes, strengthen the rights of Francophone communities and Acadian communities. And I think the province where the minority rights, linguistic rights, rights of the historic Anglophone community are most respected is Quebec. It's so respected, in fact, that we end up with anglicization of newly arrived immigrants. So it's in that spirit. It's not a way of weakening Francophones outside Quebec. We see this with all the amendments tabled by the Bloc. We'll see it as we go on, but what we want to amend is that symmetry, which has been denounced just about everywhere, at least in Quebec, and creates opposition between Quebecers and Francophone and Acadian communities, because by putting those Anglophones in Quebec on an equal footing with Francophone and Acadians outside Quebec, it's as if you're giving more rights to Francophones outside Quebec. You're weakening French in Quebec because you're giving more rights to Anglophones.
So that asymmetry has to be undone to better protect French in Quebec. I think that this isn't the right way to portray our approach. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. I have Mr. Viss to be followed by Mr. Gaudin. Mr. Viss, over to you.
It's no surprise to this committee that I've had issues with the application of provincial law into a federal statute based on my previous comments. But I was intrigued by Madame Boyer's comments just a minute ago when she talked about an asymmetrical approach to federalism. But I'm just wondering how, if it's the case here where it would be significant to make reference to a provincial statute, why did the Government of Canada include that same statute in the second part of the bill? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Madame Boyer.
Ms. Boyer.
I think the difference here is that the charter would become the legislation that we have to respect, whereas the reference later in the preamble is to describe the linguistic regime of the different provinces. So here we're implying that this would apply over the Official Languages Act in Quebec. It would, if I can explain it in a non-technical term, overrule the Federal Official Languages Act in Quebec.
Well, I understood the first time.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Viss, thank you. Monsieur Gaudin.
Mr. Gaudin to be followed by Mr. Beaulieu. Indeed, Mr. Chair, I have run my calculations. I understand clearly that the Liberals and NDP will vote against this. And as Ms. Ashton mentioned earlier, why don't we just move ahead considering this bill more quickly? I see very clearly where we're going, so I request unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment. That's a fully legitimate procedure. Is there unanimous consent to have the amendment withdrawn? Or let me go the other way. Anyone opposing? Looking at Mr. Beaulieu. Very well. So we do not have unanimous consent. Mr. Gaudin. Mr. Beaulieu, you have the floor, but we can't hear you. I didn't ask for the floor. I asked us to go to the vote, to call the vote. Can you hear me? Yes, now I can hear you. I've asked to call the vote. All right. Mr. Chair, could you ask him again whether he accepts unanimous consent or not? Because I'm not sure with the technical problems we've had hearing him, he understood this correctly. Let me begin again, Mr. Beaulieu. Here's the procedure. Mr. Godin has asked whether there is unanimous consent, which is permissible, to withdraw his amendment. That was the question that was on the floor. Is there unanimous consent? No. No? All right. Thank you. Very well, then. So we continue to discuss the amendment. Mr. Beaulieu, you are next. I would like us to call the vote. Very good, Mr. Beaulieu. Thank you. So this is all appropriate. Madam Clerk, please.
Contre.
Monsieur Iacono.
Contre.
Madame Kayabaga.
Contre.
Madame Latanzio.
Against.
Monsieur Serré.
Contre.
Monsieur Dalton.
Abstenir.
Monsieur Godin.
Mon compte était bon. Pour.
Monsieur Généreux.
Pour.
Monsieur Viss.
I'll abstain in good faith that my colleagues sought unanimity to remove the motion.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu, on vous entend pas.
We can't hear you, Mr. Beaulieu.
Et Madame Ashton.
Contre.
6 contre, 3 pour.
6 against, 3 for it, and 2 abstentions. So 6 against, 3 pro, and 2 abstentions. This is not carried. Let us move to the next clause. Mr. Viss, you wished to intervene?
On page 2, line 31, in English, C13 states, and whereas the Government of Canada recognizes that the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation contributes through its activities to enhance the vitality of English and French linguistic minority communities and to the protection and promotion of both official languages. I have a problem with this paragraph, partly because I see Radio-Canada and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation as 2 separate entities. So given that point, I also, and the second point I'd like to raise is that I don't actually believe that the CBC in English actually does much to promote English anymore. And so I would kindly ask that we rewrite
Rappel au règlement, Monsieur le Président, je comprends.
A call to order, Chair. I'm not quite sure. We're discussing motions, so we're supposed to be discussing amendments, no? So just jumping into the bill. So a clarification. What's going on here? Yes, technical clarification. We can, on the floor, propose amendments directly, as is being done. That is allowable. That is what Mr. Viss is doing. Now, we will need a written communication about it. We can refer this to our legislative clerk if you wish, but let's make sure we understand what Mr. Viss has in mind, and then we'll get back to, yes, go ahead, Mr. Viss. Please continue.
And I hadn't looked at this clause very closely before, but one, CBC and Radio-Canada are administered separately, so it doesn't make sense to have one referenced in English and one in French.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry. Just a moment. We will suspend. I must suspend. Because it's not within the order of sections. We must go through block number 1 before we get to this. Yes, there's a number of technical issues, so let us suspend just temporarily, please. Thank you. Indeed, Mr. Viss, I made a mistake. I misunderstood what you were explaining. The amendment you were putting forward is concerning lines after those proposed by the Bloc BC1 that may indeed touch on what you're saying. We can discuss it then, but give Bloc 1
19 en français commence avec la...
in French, beginning with line number 17. So it has precedence over what you are wishing to do. So I'm very sorry about this confusion. My fault. So the next amendment to be discussed is Block 1, BQ1. You have the floor, Mr. Beaulieu. Thank you. I wish to say that I've sent in a new proposed amendment to the clerk. I'm not sure if she's been able to share it with you. Yes, I confirm that we have received your new amendment. Good. So basically, the new amendment integrates the amendments of Mr. Godin, the Conservative Party, about recognizing both official languages, and also includes parts of the amendments put forward by the Liberals and the NDP with respect to Francophone immigration or French language immigrants. Basically, what we're changing here is replacing at line 17 that recognizes the requirement. Basically, the first paragraph at line 17 recognizes the duty to provide opportunities for everyone basically to learn second languages and so on and so forth. And the amendment states the duty adds the fact that it's really a duty. It's not only merely important, but there is a duty to provide opportunities for everyone. That's the new language. In Quebec, all students have then a duty to learn English as a second language. I think that would really be reasonable then, that reciprocity apply, and that across the rest of Canada, everyone have a duty to learn the second official language as a second language. So that's the first part. Shall I go through the rest? Yes, overall, Mr. Beaulieu, but you are what you're referring to when you say that this overlaps a amendment put forward by another party or another colleague, just tell us which amendments those are. For the first part, then, integrates Part A of amendment. Hang on, I'll just go get it. CPC 2, Mr. Beaulieu, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, you're correct. CPC 2. So that's for the first part. And then by deleting lines 22 to 35, once again, it's a matter of recognizing symmetry, the importance of remedying the decline, French, matter of English and French, protecting the presence. We fully agree to support the growth of the vitality of French language minority communities, but they should not be on an equal basis with our respective English linguistic minority communities within Quebec. Same is at issue in the next paragraph. So those paragraphs are to be deleted. But then in C, by replacing lines 35 to 41, here we are picking up on what was in the motion. I'll mention them. A Liberal 1, Ms. Kayabaga, which is pretty much the same as Liberal 2, Mr. Serre, which is pretty much NDP 2, Ms. Ashton, all of which aim to recognize the importance of remedying the decline in the demographic weight of French linguistic minority communities, including by restoring and increasing their demographic weight, and recognizes the relevance of French language immigration importance of Francophone immigration, then enhancing the vitality of French linguistic minority communities, including by restoring and increasing the demographic weight. We did not mention Quebec because we feel that if Quebec's linguistic approach is respected, including its approach to Francophone immigration, then, Quebec should be in a position to do the same, with respect to its immigration, because we expect Canada to do the same, given that Francophone immigration across Canada is important for Quebec. And then by deleting lines 42 to 44 for the very same reasons I've just laid out, given that it ensures equality of Francophone and Anglophone communities, that's what it does, but their needs are very different, so we disagree with that. And then by replacing line 6 on page 3, the following, we're adding here that French is the official and common language of Quebec. And so we're adding the wording, the official and common language of Quebec, given that the aim is to ensure that French be the common language, the language used to integrate immigrants. Otherwise, they wish to learn English. And English, of course, is the common language throughout the rest of Canada. And then the second point, by replacing line 16 to 29 on page 3 with the following.
We replace those lines by the following that recognizes that Francophone minorities are present in every province or territory, and that the Anglophone minority of Quebec and the Francophones in other provinces and territory have different needs. It seems obvious to me, it's difficult to deny, that Anglophones in Quebec are not in the same situation at all than Francophones outside Quebec, and Acadian communities who have difficulty getting a minimum of service in French. They're confronted with that clause about where numbers justify, which means that a large number of Francophones, a large proportion of Francophones outside Quebec, don't have access to French language services because the Official Languages Act classifies them of not being in a territory where numbers justify or warrant. That clause doesn't exist in Quebec. Anglophones get service in English just about everywhere on the territory of Quebec. And the second part is that, and I think this is fundamental, whereas the Government of Canada recognizes that the existence of a majority French society in Quebec where the future French is assured is a legitimate objective and a fundamental principle of the Canadian Official Languages regime. Because if the Official Languages Act, if the federal government really wants true equality of official languages, it must ensure that the future of French is ensured in Quebec. I think that's crucial. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Before we go any further, I must point out, so that we're all aware, that if the new amendment BQ1 is adopted, CPC 2 on page 3, Lib 1 on page 4, Lib 2 on page 5, NDP 1 on page 6, CPC 3 on page 7, Lib 3 on page 9, and Lib 4 on page 10 cannot be proposed because of conflict of lines. So, having said that, the floor is open. If there is anyone who wants to speak about BQ1, Mr. Housefather, go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to thank my friends at the committee for having welcomed me so warmly today. I'm not a member of the committee, but I follow the work of the committee with great attention, and naturally, I'd like to intervene from the outset on the philosophy of the Official Languages Act and BQ1. For over 50 years in this country, we held a position that there are two official languages in this country, two minorities, communities in official language minorities, the Anglophones in Quebec and Francophones outside Quebec, and that there was equal treatment between these two communities, and that French and English should be equal in Canada. And since I was born, that was my vision of Canada. We have two official languages that are respected throughout the country.
Quebec, you can just get services in English where numbers don't warrant. That's actually not true. The Quebec National Assembly just passed Bill 96. Bill 96 says that in order to obtain services in English from the Quebec government, you need to have had access to English schools in Quebec. That means that you have to have a parent or grandparent who was educated in English in Canada. Because as you all know, Monsieur et Madame les membres du comité, in Quebec, mother tongue does not grant you access to minority language schooling. Quebec never opted into Section 59 of the Constitution Act. So the only people that have a right to English services today in Quebec are those people who are able to claim or show they have access to English schools. Basically, more than half of the English-speaking population of Quebec, or close to, because in Canada, we count the official language minority communities by first official language spoken. That is the official way we count. They don't have access to English schools. And so now they won't get services. My friend who married an Australian, she's moved to Quebec. Her whole family speaks both English and French. They have access to English schools. They can get served in English, but she can't, even though she's come from Australia, since she's been there more than 6 months and she doesn't have access to English schools. No, I'm not saying this to be, oh, wow, the English-speaking community in Quebec is so hard done on, that's a provincial law. But the federal government should be recognizing both communities equal and protecting both minorities equally. We should not be picking and choosing one minority community over another. That is not the philosophy of the Official Languages Act, and that has never been how I think Canada has viewed minorities. We're here to protect all minorities. And by agreeing to amendments that start saying that Quebec's language regime, which 96% of English-speaking Quebecers do not agree with, right? 96% of English-speaking Quebecers oppose Bill 96. That makes use of the notwithstanding clause preemptively to say that rights are taken away without even the person having the opportunity to have a court strike down the right that's taken away. A law that says that people can't get government services unless they have access to English schools. This is not the philosophy that this committee should be bowing into and saying should now be in the Canadian Official Languages Act. Je crois que tout le monde ici, quand vous regardez l'amendement de M. Beaulieu ou vous regardez les autres amendements, quelques-uns qui ont été proposés.
If you look at Mr. Beaulieu's amendment and others, you'll look at a philosophy that's completely against history, not only of the Liberal Party of Canada, but the Conservative Party and the NDP too. As a party, we always respected minority rights. We always respected all minorities in this country.
As an English-speaking Quebecer, and I plead with you, I represent a riding which is mostly English-speaking in Quebec, and I've never had my community be so dispirited, be so unhappy, be so scared. Bill 96 has made English-speaking Quebecers feel like they don't know who stands for them anymore. They watched the National Assembly adopt a law that their community was barely consulted on and nobody agrees with. They feel like they don't know if they have a future in their own province anymore. I have a brother. He moved to Toronto long ago. I have 4 first cousins. Each of them left Quebec long ago. Most of the kids I went to school with left Quebec. They left not because they don't love Quebec and they don't love Montreal and that they're not bilingual. Nous sommes tous bilingues, les jeunes anglophones du Québec.
We young Quebecers are all bilingual.
That they had a future in a place where they didn't know if they were part of society. And we need to change that philosophy. And by the federal government, by the federal parliament, bowing in to the idea that we're no longer equal to Francophones outside Quebec and we should be treated differently, this is just an awful thing. So I plead with the members of this committee, not only when you look at BQ1, but when you look at all the amendments, please, in the Federal Official Languages Act, English and French should be equal. English and French minority language communities should be equal legally. Now, obviously, The courts have talked about substantive equality. Substantive equality means you can have legal symmetry but be treated differently based on your needs. But there should be legal symmetry. And so I thank the members of the committee for giving me this chance, et je vous remercie tous et toutes.
And I thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Housefather.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues. I have a concern about the block amendment by Mr. Beaulieu, BQ1, and that's about Aboriginal languages, because in his amendment, there's that need to withdraw certain lines that are very concerning to me, and I will read them. It recognizes, here are the existing lines that would be withdrawn. It recognizes the importance parallel to the status of official languages and the broadening of their use, the maintenance and enhancement of other languages, and the reappropriation and revitalization and reinforcement of Aboriginal or Indigenous languages. Right now, I chair the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee, and coincidentally, we're examining the Aboriginal or Indigenous Languages Act, and it's something very concerning. So, question, Mr. Chairman. Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Mr. Godin. I had a question for Mr. Garneau, because I'm trying to understand the reference you're making in the legislation. Can you show us this? Line 17 to 21, which would be withdrawn, according to my understanding. Page 3, 17 to 21. Yes, indeed. That's exactly right. Thank you, Mr. Godin. Mr. Garneau, were you finished? Yes? Mr. Généreux, followed by Mr. Godin, then Ms. Ashton, and Mr. Beaulieu. Mr. Généreux first. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Mr. Housefather and for the officials. The paragraph that seems to irritate you the most is the one that says that they have different needs, which seems to imply that Francophones and Anglophones are not on an equal footing. That's what I understand from what you're saying. The amendment is proposed by a Bloc Québécois MP for whom I have great respect, a proud Quebecer, as I am too, and who lives in Montreal. I'm in a region, but he's in Montreal. And perhaps he notes even more than I do that French is on the decline in Quebec, as well as in Canada. So the question is, if we repeat what has been done under the Official Languages Act for 50-plus years, in the next 50 years, will the result be any different? That's the first question I have for you. And for our friends, the officials, the perception, or let's say the understanding of what Mr. Housefather just said, all minorities should be treated equally or equitably the same way, and I completely agree with that. But his claim is that the amendment proposed by Mr. Beaulieu would reduce or potentially reduce services that the Quebec Anglophones would have access to. In your opinion, can you read that into this amendment or not? Mr. Housefather, somebody is asking for clarification. Go ahead. I greatly appreciate the question by my friend, Mr. Généreux, for whom I have a great deal of respect. What I said, Canadian courts have already noted that not only is there a different is there inequality, but there are differences between different communities outside Quebec and Anglophones in Quebec. An Anglophone in Montreal is not in the same situation as one in the Gaspé or in Quebec City. Francophones outside Quebec are very different. If you live where the chair lives in northern New Brunswick, where Francophones are a majority, or northern Ontario, where Mr. Serre is from, it's very different from Francophones in BC, where Mr. Viss is from, for instance. But the courts have said you can have legal symmetry, but actual inequality, and apply the differences that are necessary under legislation where everything's equal. That's not the only thing I was against in Mr. Beaulieu's amendment. He's withdrawing a lot of sentences. The idea that we have to support the vitality of both minorities, I think we all want to do that and have vitality and development. It'd be the first time the federal law recognizes that French is the common language in Quebec. There's no legal definition of common language. I had many objections, not just that, but I think in the courts have already interpreted these acts. It could advance the future of both minorities. It doesn't mean we can't advance immigration by Francophones, for instance, or do other things. It's not withdrawing rights or privileges. You have to let a minority believe that a provincial government is in charge of everything. Thank you very much for giving me that opportunity. Mr. Généreux, I think you asked Madame Boyer for her opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Généreux, could you put your question again, the question to officials? Mr. Housefather's suggestion regarding the amendment, do you, and what effect it would have, do you see that as realistic? Because we're not here to discuss Bill 96. Of course, there is a potential link to that had we carried the first amendment, which we didn't. But right now, we're not specifically discussing Bill 96, yet Mr. Housefather has referred to it. Do you think there's a real issue there about, for this clause involving official languages? Mr. Housefather is speaking about inequality for Anglophones and Francophones across all services. Is that realistic? Thank you very much. The amendment does a number of things, but for this point, I will turn to my colleague, Ms. Boily. Yes, thank you. Perhaps I will reread part of what is written here, and then I will discuss the possible effects of, recognizes the existence of a majority Francophone linguistic group, and a main point of the federal linguistic regime is to recognize this. So one of the effects here is that we are diverging from the official aims of the Official Languages Act, which are equality of status and equal rights and privileges. I believe, Ms. Boily, that you don't have the correct amendment before you. No? We are with the new BQ1 amendment to Clause 2. Oh, I see. Recognize that a majority Francophone group, I could read it to be quite clear, the last version. Mr. Chair, go ahead. Chair, what you're saying, Ms. Boily, is that it recognized the importance of reversing the remedying the decline in the demographic weight of French linguistic minority communities. Do you have that text, including by restoring and increasing their demographic weight? Yes. I will go back to Mr. Généreux. Go ahead, Mr. Généreux. Just specify your question. Yes, those two paragraphs, of course, are linked, and Mr. Beaulieu can go back to that later, but their definition is certainly similar, their aim, at least. And Mr. Housefather claims today that these sections would reduce the equality of Francophones and Anglophones with regard to the services that the current legislation allows them to have. Is that true or not? Does that make sense? What I was saying earlier, in the wording, if the basic premise is to ensure the future demographic weight of French linguistic communities, this is diverging from the aims of the current federal legislation, which is to ensure equality of treatment of both languages. All right. So replacing the lines as suggesting here, that reinforces basically what Mr. Housefather is said. I see a nodding of the head of our witness, so I guess it's yes. Is this good, Mr. Généreux? Mr. Généreux, Mr. Godin, I'm not sure if you wish to speak after Mr. Généreux. If not, I have Ms. Ashton, Mr. Beaulieu, and Ms. Latanzio. So over to you then. No, well, you could call me Mr. Godin with the confusion that you made earlier between myself and Mr. Beaulieu. I'm sorry, Mr. Beaulieu and Mr. Godin. Go ahead, Mr. Godin, then. Thank you, Chair. I would like to go back to the comment made by my colleague, Mr. Housefather, who I greatly appreciate and who I think certainly puts forward very good arguments for the group he represents, and that's quite legitimate. And as parliamentarians, that's the sort of work that we do. Let me go back to the philosophy then, the underlying philosophy. 52 years ago, a bill was written up, and the Canadian reality then, 52 years ago, is not the same as it is today. Not the same landscape. And if there's any concern, and we, having heard our witnesses, we all agree that French is in decline. That's the reality. But so we can agree that the only language that's currently vulnerable is French. So the philosophy, the approach behind Mr. Beaulieu's suggestion is one of ensuring there are mechanisms to recognize the special nature of French in Quebec, and of course the English-speaking minority within Quebec is not vulnerable in the same way as French linguistic minority communities outside of Quebec. This is what I mean by recognizing the specificities of French within Quebec. That's where I was going with the first part of my amendment, or that's what needs to be kept in mind. We need to ensure that we set up mechanisms such that after C13 is adopted, when it receives royal sanction, we will have clarified that French is the language that is the most vulnerable in Canada. So it's not a matter of sort of satisfying Quebec and giving it everything it asks for. It's really a matter of recognizing the data, and this data applies to French communities outside of Canada, which are in a different situation than Anglophone communities within Quebec. Ms. Ashton, to be followed by Mr. Beaulieu. Ms. Ashton, you have the floor. I'm wondering if Mr. Beaulieu's hand was up before mine. I thought it was. Very well, then Mr. Beaulieu. Mr. Housefather spoke twice before I was able to get a word in. Edgewise. Go ahead then, Mr. Beaulieu. All right, let me just make sure we all understand the facts. What Mr. Housefather said is untrue. What I said is that Anglophones in Quebec have a right to receive, or outside of Quebec, have a right to receive English language services pretty much everywhere. What Mr. Housefather wants is, for newcomers, that we broaden access to these rights to a large proportion of newcomers, immigrants who are close to English, who and that's something we can't accept because it leads to our continuing down the path of minority status. When Mr. Housefather says that the Official Languages Act ensures equal status, equality of status, that's not true. It's not true within Quebec. And one of the specialists who seem to say that ensuring that French has a future in Quebec is not a matter of equality of status and use, because for her, the act is about equality of access to services in French or in English where numbers justify. And what we need to take for granted is that the positive effects of the federal law in Quebec is not at all about equality. It 100% strengthens, enhances English in Quebec. When it comes to injustices, Quebecers have experienced injustice continuously. We can really go back in history since probably forever. And even today, universities, Anglophone universities, receive, I mean, it depends, but from 35 to 40% of federal funding for that 9% of Anglophones, more or less, in the province of Quebec. So this really is not equality of status that we have achieved under the Official Languages Act for French linguistic communities of Quebec. In a number of sectors, it's the same story. So keep in mind that 100% of the funding, I think that it's $68 million a year as of 52 years, goes exclusively to strengthen and advance the English education system in Quebec, which is already overfunded. And of course, the Official Languages Act has always ensured that official services be available for Anglophones in Quebec. But especially since 101, we've tried to push back on the anglicization of newcomers to Quebec. Just look at the demographic figures for Quebec. We could provide you with a number of such arguments. All Anglophones being bilingual, young ones are. That too is incorrect. There has been progress. Young Anglophones in Montreal are more bilingual than young Francophones, but if you look at Francophones outside of Quebec, they're all bilingual, like 100%, and the Anglophones are bilingual, like 9 or 10% outside of Quebec. So there's two measures being used, two approaches. So this is a discourse that is being supported by groups such as Alliance Quebec, now the QCGN. Mr. Housefather was chair of that in its old version, which is kind of a discourse to the effect that everything's a matter of justice, injustice, equal rights or not. I think that the injustice has really been felt by the Francophones in Quebec. They have been unjustly treated for ever so long. And the whole approach is really supporting the anglicizations of Quebec and the continuous decline of French in Quebec. Unless we can see these as two distinct situations, that's going to be the result. But I do want to make a point. Mr. Garneau brought up something, an interesting point, I think. I hadn't seen that myself. What I would like is, or if someone else could, change the amendment, supplement the amendment to ensure that solely lines 12 to 16 be at issue in the French text, because we have always supported the indigenous languages, recognizing them and strengthening them and so on. So I would be quite happy to withdraw that part that affects indigenous languages, but I can't amend my own amendment. So yes, all you can do is ask for unanimous consent to completely withdraw the entirety of your amendment, but changing it, no, you must leave that to someone else. What I wish to underscore is that we support the rights of First Nations peoples and their right to ensure that their languages, too, have a future. Very well. Duly noted, but you'll have to leave that to someone around the table to put forward such an amendment if they so wish. Have you finished, Mr. Beaulieu? Yes, thank you so much. Ms. Ashton, over to you. All right, thank you. I wish to share our position Of course, we agree with some of the points put forward in the amendment, but we cannot support other parts of it, including withdrawing some of the sections. I do appreciate the member being open to including language about Indigenous languages. That's essential. But we still have problems with other parts of what's being proposed here. I do understand the spirit in which this is being done, but I do want to share my understanding. Mr. Généreux has brought up an important point, but we would like to go ahead with this bill, working on this bill. It's already 12:44. We haven't even voted on 2 amendments, and I think that communities across the country, including all Francophones in Quebec, would like us to move forward with this bill. That's my concern, that we're not moving through our work. In fact, we're pretty much at a standstill, given that we have dozens of amendments to consider in the weeks to come. Thank you, Ms. Ashton. I also have in order Ms. Dalton, Viss, and then Serré. Mr. Dalton. Ms. Latanzio, you indeed come in first. So you have the floor. Thank you, Chair.
My next question is again to government officials. So we know that the scope from the get-go is to promote and protect the French language across the country. And our views is in Quebec, the Anglophones were quite in agreement with that premise, so long as it's not to the detriment of the linguistic minority community, and in Quebec, obviously, the Anglophones. So I wanted to have your opinion with regards to the amendment that's being proposed in doing away with paragraphs 19 to 44 on page 2, and I will take the time to read them and ask you if this would meet that objective. That is, that we would be, in fact, by deleting all these paragraphs, promoting and protecting the French language and not to the detriment of the Anglophone linguistic community in Quebec. And whereas the Government of Canada recognizes the importance of providing opportunities for everyone of Canada to learn a second official language and the contribution of everyone in Canada who speaks both official languages to a mutual appreciation between the 2 official language communities of Canada. And whereas the Government of Canada recognizes the importance of supporting sectors that are essential to enhancing the vitality of English and French linguistic minority communities and protecting and promoting the presence of strong institutions serving these communities, and whereas the Government of Canada recognizes that the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation contributes through its activities to enhance the vitality of the English and French linguistic minority communities and to the protection and promotion of both official languages. And whereas the Government of Canada recognizes the importance of the contribution of Francophone immigration to enhancing the vitality of the French linguistic minority communities, and that immigration is one of the factors that contributes to maintaining and increasing the demographic weight of those communities, and whereas the Government of Canada recognizes the presence of English and French linguistic minority communities in each province and territory.
Boyer.
Thank you very much for your question. I will refrain from giving my opinion, but I will explain what this amendment intends to do. With the removal, or the first part A of the amendment, says that the Government of Canada recognizes the importance, but it would be modified to say, and let me go back, the duty to provide opportunities for everyone to learn a second language. So here I want to note that this creates an obligation on the federal government in the education sector, which is an entirely provincial jurisdiction. So we're just imposing that on provinces. The second part of this amendment would suppress, so delete, the government recognizes the importance of supporting sectors that are essential to enhancing the vitality of English and French linguistic minority communities. So this was, the intention was to reflect what was added in Part 7 of the legislation to support institutions in official language minority communities that are important to the vitality of these communities. So that would be removed. We would remove also that the Government of Canada recognizes the contribution of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in French, la Société Radio-Canada, and that the creation of news supports the vitality of official language minority communities. And then if I continue, Part C of the Blocs Amendment would recognize the importance of contribution of Francophone immigration to enhancing the vitality of French linguistic minority communities, and that immigration, and let me find the exact wording, it's a little bit difficult on the street, is one of the factors that contributes to maintaining or increasing the demographic weight of those communities. And that would be maintained, say, including by restoring, just move it up, and increasing the demographic weight. And this also creates an obligation. I don't have do you have the paper? Because I can't work my Zoom.
Well, it's basically changing the word to restoring, en français, assurer. Donc, c'est ça la nuance.
That's the nuance.
Rétablissement et accroissement. It's hard to do this in both languages, yes. But we changed the word to restore.
Donc, je vais prendre, je suis.
So I'm going to follow this in French. So here, to ensure the development of these Francophone communities, that's an obligation being created for the federal government, but in an area of shared jurisdiction. We don't have all the means in the federal government to ensure that immigration continues to increase the demographic weight. I'd ask my colleague, Mr. Duruisseau, from Immigration to comment. Indeed, there's a nuance which, with this term, ensure, the hands of the federal government would be tied and have an obligation to produce results in an area of shared jurisdiction. The provincial government plays a role here. Not to mention that the success of Francophone immigration depends on a number of factors. There's attraction, retention. We know that one key factor is employment. The labor market plays a fundamental role here. And of course, the supply of services, essential services such as healthcare, education in these communities in different regions, that's a key factor. So another area where the provinces and territories, the municipalities, play essential roles. Thank you very much. And if you allow me to continue, this amendment also proposes deleting the section, or rather lines 42 to 44 in French, the diversity of provincial and territorial linguistic regimes, and Amendment E simply recognizes the Charter of the French language, and that French is the official and common language of Quebec. So we're looking at, we lose the linguistic regimes of other provinces and territories, and the use of other languages, the reappropriation and revitalization of Indigenous languages, and a reminder that the legal obligations for official languages always apply, including during emergencies such as the pandemic. So there are a lot of deletions proposed here. If you'll allow me, yes, I have a subsequent question here. What I'm to conclude, given your reading, and I think it agrees with mine, is that there's loss, considerable loss. And it doesn't achieve the objective of promoting and protecting French. I think it would be to the detriment of minority linguistic communities. So I thank you for that. Thank you, Ms. Latanzio. Mr. Dalton. Yes, Mr. Chairman. I know that we're not moving fast. This is just the second amendment here. But this is a very important discussion. It's worth discussing and talking about. I do appreciate the comments of my colleagues, Mr. Godin, Mr. Housefather. It's important. Everyone here agrees and knows that French is on the decline. This is something that is dear to our hearts, and I and my colleague, Mr. Viss, see this in BC and elsewhere, and we want to strengthen French. That's one thing, and that's my heart. I also lived in Quebec a long time ago, and I went to school in French, secondary 1, 2, and 3, in Chibougamau. It was in English. So I am sensitive to the situation of Anglophones in Quebec. So I'm torn here. I'm really torn about this. I also want to strengthen things, but I know even in Quebec, the situation of Francophones in a sea of Anglophones all around them is difficult. They're vulnerable. They feel vulnerable. So those are things that will inform my vote. Both sides of the situation. We have to see both sides. So I just want to say that I appreciate this. Thank you. That's much appreciation, Mr. Dalton. Mr. Viss.
Some of the points I wanted to raise, but potentially Madame Boyer can explain to us. This is the preamble of the act, and my understanding, and you said significantly that this would impact X, Y, and Z significantly. My understanding of legislation is that a preamble is not something the courts would generally interpret or would assume a government of Canada would be obliged to follow through. So I would challenge your even if I agree with some of the statements you make, I would challenge your interpretation of the impact a preamble will have on the applicability of legislation. If you could comment on that, please.
Allez-y, Madame Boyer.
Go ahead, Ms. Boyer.
Perhaps I'll turn to the legislative clerks, would be that the entirety of the law is taken into consideration when it's interpreted by the courts.
Je vais suspendre un instant.
I will suspend for a moment. Committee, the legislative analysts just interpret procedure, not give legal advice. So, Mr. Viss, you have a good question there.
But you need legal advice for that. Oui, Madame Boyer, allez-y.
Ms. Boyer, go ahead. I can confirm that it would apply, but let me remind you that the preamble is a summary of everything in the bill. So, indeed, if you change certain parts of the bill, it could modify the preamble at the end.
Online, excuse me. Last night, reclaiming, revitalizing, and strengthening Indigenous languages. What other sections of this law actually do that? Because I represent one of the most diverse ridings in Canada. I have 6 different First Nations with their own unique languages. Is there anything in this law other than this paragraph here in the preamble which gives money or assurances that Indigenous languages will be enhanced or protected? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci.
Thank you. Ms. Boilly, did you want to add anything? Yes, thank you. I'd like to
article, but yes, there is a reference to the importance of maintaining and protecting the revitalization of the Indigenous languages. It's Article 83 in Bill C-13. And someone, thank you very much, Julie, so I can read it out loud. It's about rights relating to other languages. Nothing in this act abrogates or derogates from any legal or customary right acquired or enjoyed either before or after the coming into force of this act with respect to any language other than English or French, including any indigenous language. So that's the reference.
I was asking this question because I believe in the previous 2 parliaments ago, there was an Indigenous languages bill passed, and the applicability of this law in respect to other obligations of Parliament, I think, are important to recognize when new language regarding Indigenous languages is included in this bill. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Viss. Monsieur Serré.
Mr. Serré, you're next. Thank you, and followed by Mr. Beaulieu and then Mr. Godin. Go ahead, Mr. Serré. Well, I just wanted to add, I agree with Ms. Ashton, we should proceed faster. Mr. Dalton mentioned it. Today's conversations should enrich next meetings. We don't want to repeat the conversation we had today. It's a good conversation, but I would encourage Mr. Beaulieu to read his own amendments, because it's quite clear that there are exceptions here. I don't agree with BQ1 because, as Mr. Garneau mentioned, there's the exclusion of Indigenous languages, and under lines 22, 23, 24, if ever the government had an emergency, the amendment proposed by Mr. Beaulieu would remove this whole thing. So I don't know why we should consider this amendment. And third point, as I mentioned earlier with Mr. Godin's amendment, the amendment deletes recognition of various dynamics. A linguistic dynamic within a province, once again. So it's full of deletions here. So I agree with my 2 colleagues here. I think it's an amendment that we should vote against. I will vote against it, and we should proceed as quickly as possible to the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. I think that your hand was up. We don't hear you. All right. In response to Mr. Serré, that's why we like to have enough time to do things correctly. Right now, we're being pushed. We have to fight back a limitation of debate, and so we're trying to get everything in. But, of course, we can be more flexible. It's not true that we don't recognize the diversity of linguistic regimes. When we say that we recognize Francophone minorities in each province and territory, French linguistic minorities, what we need is to be able to respond to the specific needs of French linguistic minority communities in each province and territories rather than having a wall-to-wall approach. That's what is inappropriate and damaging because, of course, living in a pure free choice regime always gives right and might to the strongest. We want to ensure that the federal legislation be tailored to the needs of each community. Mr. Beaulieu, no, I wasn't trying to interrupt you, Mr. Beaulieu. It's just that we are out of time. We have a little extra time. We're told that we can continue working with unanimous consent for yet a few minutes longer. No, we don't have unanimous consent. One moment. And we're in good faith. Discipline, please. I can see by glancing all around the table that there are other obligations. People have other meetings to get to, so we don't have unanimous consent. Mr. Beaulieu. So sorry, but we will return to this at our next meeting. Just a moment, if I may, everyone. We will meet on the 15th of December to continue this clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-13. Please, discipline. Kind friends. As we have a very appropriate tone here so far, let's I would like to advise you that last Friday, in the name of the committee, I appeared at the Liaison Subcommittee, and we have an approval of our requests for travel expenses. I will now take this to the House of Commons for a final approval. All's well. And meeting adjourned.
Oh, bateau à voile.